The following stories are about two people who experience missing time. Robert Matthews. At 8:45 p.m. on October the 1st, 1966, a bus arrived in the small village of North Truro in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and only one man alighted from the bus. Robert Matthews, 19, from Philadelphia, was reporting for his first tour of duty at the North Truro Air Force Base, and although it was early in the evening, the small village appeared deserted. The bus driver had told him where to get off, and then he was to phone the base where they would send someone to pick him up. While he was standing there, he saw some lights moving from right to left across the sky, and for some strange reason was overcome with fear. He again called the base and they asked him where he'd been, and he told them he'd been standing there waiting for them to arrive to pick him up. They told him they'd already sent someone to pick him up, and Robert said that he'd been waiting there but nobody had turned up. The Air Force told him that a driver had arrived to pick him up at 8:50 p.m, 5 minutes after he'd called them, but he was nowhere in sight. 1 hour later at 9:45 p.m, Robert again called the base, but as far as Robert was concerned, the phone call he made had been less than 4 minutes and not 1 hour. The man at the base said to Robert, "I want to know where you were for that 1 hour because they sent a jeep out to where you said you'd be standing and you weren't there." When Robert Matthews eventually arrived at the base, he was questioned extensively by Air Force personnel, and they interrogated him about where he'd been for the last hour, where Robert stuck to his story. He told them they had been in the same location in the village the whole time. They asked him about the 3 lights he claimed to have seen that came down from the sky towards him and asked to describe what type of aircraft they were. This line of questioning went on for a long time. Robert figured it was part of basic training and thought this is what they do to new guys. He was asked whether he'd been drinking before he got off the bus, and he replied no. What is interesting about this case was that Robert Matthews had been dealing with a secret that had haunted him for the past 30 years and had seriously bothered him long before his experience in the village at Cape Cod. When Robert was a child about 6 years old, he suddenly woke up one night, and as he looked to the right in his bedroom, he saw a figure standing there. It looked to be a small figure with a green glow around it. He quickly sat up in bed and tried to scream, but nothing came out of his mouth, and he also thought that he'd lost his hearing and his voice and didn't know what was going on. Then this thing, or what he thought was a ghost, came over and sat down on his bed and pulled up his pajama top and started doing something to his chest. Then everything went black and he was laying back down on the bed. The following morning, he told his mother that there'd been a ghost in his room during the night. She reassured him that he was only having a nightmare. From that moment, Robert continued to doubt his sanity, wondering whether or not the incident that night really happened. In the winter of 1987, Robert was on vacation and was looking for something to read. He came upon a book that had been written by someone called Bud Hopkins. On its cover was a creature, and when he looked further at the book, he thought to himself, that's the thing that was in my room that night. After he read the book, he thought someone had stepped into his head, taken his innermost fears, and wrote them in a book, and it brought tears to his eyes. He couldn't believe it had actually happened to someone else. Anyone with an interest in UFOs knows that Bud Hopkins was an American artist, author, and ufologist, and was a prominent figure in alien abduction phenomena and related UFO research. Bud Hopkins said that when Robert Matthews called him about the details of his case, he said it had that familiar ring of truth to him and was quite convinced that this was not a dream. To Hopkins, Robert sounded troubled and curious, but very stable. After weeks of intensive interviews, Bud Hopkins put Robert Matthews under hypnosis to explore the details of Robert's childhood experiences. Under hypnosis, Robert was able to recall what happened to him that night in the small village of Cape Cod. It's the evening of October the 1st, 1966, and Robert believed that something was really wrong because all of a sudden he got very afraid. Robert said, "I'm going to call the base and tell them that there's something strange happening." His recollections were so vivid that he was able to return to reconstruct what he believes took place in the village that night. Under hypnosis, he observed in the sky 3 lights moving about. They hovered about and the red one came at him extremely fast. It arrived so fast that if he had blinked his eye, he didn't think he would have seen it, and it momentarily hovered in the parking lot. He can see some lights coming from a crack. Then a ramp comes down. He can see a lot of light coming out of the doorway. He walked up to it and walked up the ramp and looked inside. He saw 4 beings sitting on the left and 2 sitting on the right. They reminded him of a doctor's office and looked clinical and clean. He remembers sitting down on the bench and looking down and could see that his shoes and shirt were off. They came over and examined his chest and then had a discussion with each other. Like so many others, Robert Matthews had been abducted since childhood. Until he was hypnotized, had no idea that this had been happening to him. Christina Florence. In 1974, Christina, 17, was in the Mojave Desert with her mother and older sister. They were crossing the Mojave en route to San Francisco near Barstow, California. Their car overheated, so they took the first exit off the highway. The girls were told to stay in the car, roll up the windows and lock the doors. Then their mother set out walking to get some water. Because of the heat, Florence's sister got out of the car and she heard her run around the back. Then all of a sudden she said, "Oh my God, come out here quick." The next thing she remembered was that they were lying on a blanket in the middle of the park as if they were having a little nap. Their mother was still not around and they said, "Whoa, what happened?" The next thing she remembers were the 3 of them were driving like hell. They never talked about it until her sister called her one day and they began to talk about it further. They realized that they both had this very bizarre memory of missing time. She knew about Bud Hopkins and decided to get in touch with him. Florence said she really wasn't interested in UFOs or meeting some guy doing UFO research, but nevertheless in 1986 she agreed to undergo hypnosis, hoping to recall some details about what had happened to her and her sister that afternoon in Barstow, California. Under hypnosis, she pictured her sister getting out of the car and then she got out of the car. She looked up and there was something above the car and she was very scared. She didn't know what it was and ran back to the car and hid onto the dashboard. Now terrified, she was trying to start the car and it wouldn't start. Still under hypnosis, her next memory was on a table and there were some people around. They're pulling on her leg. There was a screen that was about as wide as a large television screen, but it was paper thin and was moving around the table and wasn't attached to anything. She could see 3-dimensional shapes of her skull and her whole body. It was taking pictures. The room was huge and spherical shaped and completely covered with dials. They put rubber pants on her with things attached and then they left the room and she laid there. She was asking for her sister and was told her sister was all right. Then the dials started going around and the aliens came back to the room, and that's the last thing she remembered. They then found themselves lying on the grass. All in all, Christina was angry about what had happened to her, but over the years she's been able to accept what happened and just got on with her life despite the abduction. Christine went on to live a perfectly normal life. She had a dance company and owned an apartment with 2 cats. She said that there's definitely something going on, and what it is, she doesn't know. Maybe she's having a dream, and everyone else is also having the same dream. She said she was not lying and was not crazy. In summing up, if Robert Matthews and Christina Florence and the hundreds of others like them are not lying, and we admit the possibility that these abductions have occurred, it raises frightening questions. Why are the abductors here? Their main focus appears to be about reproducing, where they take sperm and ovum samples, and the central focus seems to deal with the idea of an ongoing genetic experiment. Are the abductees involuntary victims in an ongoing genetic experiment? There is an incredibly high incidence of gynecological, physiological history of symptoms that has not appeared in the rest of the population. The thought of aliens conducting reproductive experiments seems totally unbelievable, yet those who have experienced it insist it is real, painfully real. The numbers of cases, the emotional distress and the physical marks gives weight to the evidence. To many people, the abduction by aliens seems outrageous, yet those who have experienced missing time episodes believe that is exactly what happened to them. But even the most skeptical have to admit that there is a possibility that these unbelievable events might actually have taken place and continue to take place.